When I saw this book being advertised by the publisher, Feminism for the 99%, which the book I'm holding in my hand, if you're watching or rather than listening on the radio or podcast, Feminism for the 99% of Manifesto, I knew I had to buy it. And when I read the paragraph I'm about to read to you now, I knew I had to talk to one of the authors. The book is by Cinzia Arruzza, Tithi Bhattacharya, and Nancy Fraser. And the paragraph in question goes as follows. Our answer to lean-in feminism is kick-back feminism. We have no interest in breaking the glass ceiling while leaving the vast majority to clean up the shards. Far from celebrating women CEOs who occupy corner offices, we want to get rid of CEOs and corner offices. So well said. So joining us now, I'm delighted to report, is Tithi Bhattacharya. She is a professor, an associate professor, and the director of global studies at Purdue University. She was one of the main organizers of the International Women's Strike here in the United States. She's on the editorial board of the International Socialist Review, and she joins us now. So first of all, Tithi Bhattacharya, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me, Richard, and please call me Tithi.
Thank you. That's very kind. And let's start with this, probably an obvious question, but I'll ask it anyway, just to frame the conversation. What inspired the three of you to write this book?
Well, the short answer is what inspired us to write the book was the feminist movement that, first manifested itself in the Polish strike for abortion rights in 2016, and then sort of blossomed into this international event across the globe on March 8th of 2017. I mean, this kind of an international day of feminist action, I have never seen in my lifetime, and I don't think we have seen since any time after the 60s movements receded. So this was an astonishing sort of expression of feminist rage at the system that had taken bread from our tables for 40 years of neoliberalism and had taken our roses as well in commodifying culture, selling our bodies, and denigrating every aspect of not just gender existence, but also human existence. So the feminist strikes was what really inspired us, not prompted, inspired us to write the book. And in the book, what we try to do is give expression to the politics of the strike. So rather than, often, as was the case in, let's say, the 1980s or even the 90s at the height of neoliberalism and austerity, the academy was kind of very separate from the streets because social movements had waned and social struggles were few and far between. So academics tended to pontificate and tell social movements what to do, where they were going wrong. This is a reverse I think, movement that we try to enact in the book. What we try to do is learn from the movement and try to enhance its politics by spreading it wider. And, Cinzia and I were both national organizers for the women's strike. And since 2017, we've spent most of our non-teaching time sort of connecting with feminist activists across the globe and trying to harden those networks of solidarity and widen those networks of solidarity. So that's where the book started. And I want to end by saying that the book is still a starting point. It is not the last word. I think the last word will, of course, be spoken on the streets and not on the pages of a book. But the book should be seen and read as a starting point of how we should participate in the feminist struggle and what we can learn from the feminist struggle.
So, in a sense, it's more democratic in origin and by design than the typical book is kind of oracular view of these are what we think the movement should do. It's rather a kind of receiving transmissions from the movement and trying to shape those into something that would be useful to it going forward. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Absolutely. It is to generalize the politics of the movement and to try to create more nodal points of spreading this the politics and inciting movements elsewhere. So since 2017, the movement has spread. So for this 2019 was the first year that the Swiss feminists went on strike. Now, they did not strike on March 8th, but they struck in June because that was a day that was significant to Swiss history. But I was in Geneva in April and talking to some of the organizers of the strike there. And they said to me that, in 2017 or even in 2018, we would have never imagined that we could pull off a national strike in Switzerland. Things were just so, austerity was on the rise. We felt that things were just so calm in a bad way, in the sense that the status quo was strong. But somehow after 2018, the movement started to build and spread, and mainly under the issue of migrant justice. So to defend the rights of migrant communities, the movement kind of arose. And that kind of blossomed into local assemblies and so on. And then they pulled off a national strike in June this year. So, so the book is kind of trying to capture that spirit of continuous movement, development, and growth that the feminist movement currently has across the globe.
Well, I want to take a second, if you will, and talk about the word feminism, because for me, it's been a strange journey in a sense for me. I mean, I was very young, but I was I was alive and reading and absorbing when not the first wave, but maybe the second wave of feminists came along, and I always saw them, Shulamith Firestone, for example, as deeply revolutionary figures in their thought, in their willingness to reconceive the economic, social, biological relations between men and women and society, between women and the economy. And then, and my focus has always been more economic and so on. I mean, writing things like the war on women is a class war and that type of thing. And then I found myself deeply displaced in the United States dialogue or upended to a certain extent, because suddenly I was being told that if I didn't support a kind of politics that is best exemplified by a Hillary Clinton or a Sheryl Sandberg, the lean-in feminism, it always seemed to me, that's why I read the paragraph I read from the book, it always seemed to me that class inequalities, economic inequalities, labor exploitation hurt women most of all. And all of a sudden I was, if I gave those things importance and credence, and leaving aside the fact that I'm a man, because I saw, we don't have to leave it aside, but I saw women attacked in this way as well, that this was a betrayal. All of a sudden I was seeing feminism represented in opposition to what we used to call, maybe still call, class struggle, as opposed to inexorably intertwined with it. And so that word feminism, I think you mean it in a different and more international sense than has come to be used in this country in the last few years, but I'm curious about that.
So you basically, you are recounting for us, for me, the central argument of the book, which is why, I think we wrote the book. So if you, as you rightly point out, the focus of socialist feminism and the focus of labor movements or progressive movements, Marxist movements, prior to sort of the neoliberal moment was the enemy was very clear. It was the right wing, which obviously attacked women's rights. And the progressive side of the movement was for women's rights. But the focus always was on women's labor. The kind of labor women did both in the workplace and in the home. So socialist feminists tried to talk about, domestic labor as having this profound importance in actually being a presupposition to all wage labor. So unless there was domestic labor done, wage labor could not be made possible. And of course, socialist feminists also talked about women's work in the workplace, where women were often, underpaid, undervalued, and so on. So the focus of women's emancipation was always focused around the kind of labor women did in both paid and unpaid way. And the argument always was that women's labor sustains the world, so we need to make it so that labor can be done in a meaningful, collaborative way rather than in backbreaking, profit-extracting way. So that's been sort of the focus or trope under which women's feminism was imagined in the sort of pre-neoliberal era by socialists and feminists and Marxists. The neoliberal era has a strange kind of twist, I would say, where austerity pundits and austerity mongers actually deployed the language of feminism in order not to focus on women's work or labor in this comprehensive sense, but to focus on women's success. So that's a very different, I think, counterposition. As opposed to women's work that sustains the world, the focus under neoliberalism became on women's success. And who could fault, in a general sense, if someone came into a girls' school, elementary school or middle school, and talked about women becoming successful CEOs and successful senators and successful successful congresspersons, alongside of becoming successful engineers and so on, right? So this focus on success is a very distinct neoliberal twist on the rhetoric and goals, project of feminism as a whole. I always, I did not grow up in the US, so when I first encountered a box of Girl Scout cookies, I saw in the box, it said, Girl Scout cookies make your child become be aware of business models and become successful entrepreneurs. And I thought, really, the cookies are delicious, and I buy some for my daughter. But I thought, how profoundly has neoliberalism seeped into the very capillaries of our childhoods and our existence, that even in this sort of project, we are not promoting young girls sharing food, perhaps, or cooking, perhaps, but young girls through this avenue becoming entrepreneurs, in other words, little mini capitalists. So the second version of feminism dominated mainstream discourse, at least, started dominating mainstream discourse from the 80s onwards. The Prime Minister of England was Margaret Thatcher, so she was the head of one of the most powerful nations of the world. So wasn't this a success for feminism? The fact that she ruined millions of lives in Britain through her austerity politics it seemed irrelevant to the success of the self rather than the emancipation of the collective. So against this, I think the rhetoric of feminism kind of shriveled up, I would say, in the mainstream media and mainstream discourse into becoming this rhetoric of female success in the capitalist world.
Can I just jump in for a second? And again, we're talking with Professor Tithi Bhattacharya. And Tithi, you know, as you were talking, what I was thinking about in part was I was thinking about my own childhood. I did grow up in this country. I grew up at a time when women were very much more oppressed, and certainly more overtly culturally oppressed than today. When I grew up, Girl Scout cookies didn't say anything about entrepreneurship, for example. They were just, while we boys were supposed to be Boy Scouts out hunting and trapping, which I was inept at, by the way, they were supposed to be making cookies. That was the message of or at least distributing them. That was the message of Girl Scout cookies. But one of the things that popped into my head, and this is one of the things I think about a lot in the context of sort of neoliberal feminism. For example, I was told as a young white boy, you can grow up to be anything you want. You can grow up to be president of the United States you want. Well, the fact is, I couldn't grow up to be president of the United States. I was raised in a religious minority. My parents were teachers. We didn't have the power or influence of Kennedy's. And, you know, I suppose if I had been willing to, you know, aggressively prostitute myself night and day, I might have had a shot at it. But now I see a form of feminism that takes sometimes genuine and sincere-hearted joy in telling young girls, you can be anything you want, but you can't. But you can't because we live in a system, this is my feeling, because we live in a system that shunts people off in unfulfilling sidetracks based not only on gender, not only on race, but on other factors like wealth, level of wealth at birth, class, and so on. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, because I don't think it's just a perversion of feminism. I think it's a co-option of feminism for oppressive purposes. But am I wrong?
No, that's absolutely right. But and on that point, you know, I think one way to look at it is an improvement, if you like, from what you say, you know, the 1940s or 50s, when, you know, Girl Scout cookies may have said, oh, you're baking cookies while the boy is hunting. So over that, it might be an improvement for them to be business owners. But if we really think hard on it, it really isn't. It's just two kinds of bad, because on the one hand, both of those activities, which is, you know, isolation in the domestic sphere of women as, you know, housewives, the other being successful CEOs to oppress other women and men. I mean, both are two sides of the same capitalist conundrum that it's offering us. And I think we should be able to reject both. That when we say in a classroom, you know, my child is 11 years old, I wish someone would come to her classroom and say, you can be anything you want, and list the kind of jobs that enhance the living conditions of humanity, rather than jobs that are about money or power, which actually curb the potential of humanity. You know, I do not see being president as something absolutely fantastic if the president is someone who is the head of an imperialist nation that wages wars, erects walls at borders, and you know, puts migrant children in cages. So I don't think that's a great achievement. Instead, if we said that you produce food, you work on climate change, you work on enhancing the life quality by working on healthcare, you know, being a nurse is a far more honorable profession, in my view, than being a senator. So I think we need to stop capitalist ideas dictating to us that success within the system is the real meaning of success. Instead, I think we should look at success only when someone's work or job is to enhance the richness of human life and human living. So that's where I think the new feminist movement is trying to refocus our attention on the political nature of care and care work. And I don't see care just in the sort of, interpersonal way where women care for families and loved ones and do sort of care work in the community. But we're talking about care in a much more expanded sense where, I see any labor that is done that tries to heal the injuries of class as this sort of insurgent care. So, hospitals that try to repair working class lives, public parks that try to give working class families, a decent living neighborhood of rich neighborly interactions. These are all I see instances of social care. And I think instead of success within capitalism, if we refocus our goals as this kind of care work in this broad sense, and that's by which we measure human success, I think that is something that this new feminist movement is trying to teach us, especially with the climate crisis looming.
So, and I want to talk about that in a second too. Again, we're talking with Professor Tithi Bhattacharya about her the book she co-authored, Feminism for the 99%. And when you talk about honoring people who perform this care work, whether on an individual or social level, that's more, you could say, lateral than vertical, right? That's more according someone a sense of distinction, not because they've risen to the top, quote unquote, but because they've helped others laterally. And to me, what goes along with that is the elevation, not just of individual achievement, but of collective achievement, the sense that people can, I'm curious your thoughts about that, but does this new form of feminism also, one of the things I've been really happy to see about younger activists, for example, is the genuine sense which I've seen some people, for example, turn down a chance to become individually famous as a spokesman for a movement or discourage it in order to say, well, we're a movement, we speak for each other, there's no one leader or spokesman. So I'm just wondering to what extent the world might learn from this new feminist movement in terms of thinking and acting and honoring one another for collective deeds as well as individual deeds.
I think we have a lot to learn, and I think this is where the movement is developing new ways of doing politics, if you like. So, for instance, one of the most important slogans that the movement threw up as early as 2017 was "Solidarity is our weapon." Now, in that phrase are seeded so many ideas of how to leverage human collectivities in order to build anti-systemic struggle, right? So, because what it's saying is that it doesn't matter that I myself am not Palestinian. It doesn't matter that I myself am not disabled. What matters is I will try to build so in solidarity of your struggle as a Palestinian or your struggle as a disabled person or a trans person, instead of saying, we are merely allies in the sense that, we are sort of standing apart a little bit and kind of supporting your struggle from the outside. What we're saying, what the new feminist movement is teaching us is, I am in solidarity with you, not because of moralistic reasons that, I'm a good person and I want to support the right causes, but I'm in solidarity with you because my freedom is tied up with yours. My emancipation is tied up with yours. Unless you are free, I cannot be free. So in a way, it is in my interest to fight for your liberation. So that kind of organic, strong solidarity is something that the feminist movement is clearly articulating, which is why the movement tends to be very, how do I best put it, tends to mutate very quickly. So for instance, in Argentina, the movement really started with it started as an anti-femicide movement, right? Ni una menos, not one more. So against the killing of girls and women. So that's how it began in Argentina, and they had massive strikes in 2016. But in Argentina, then, because the movement was so strong, and it was the only social movement that had that sort of mass expression, then it started to influence the labor movement. It started to influence the abortion rights movement. So actually, Ni Una Menos built these public assemblies during the vote for abortion rights in Argentina. And even though the vote lost by a small margin, it was actually a fantastic demonstration of strength. And most of the most radical activists of that abortion rights movement, was it last year? Yeah, it was last year, was the 15-year-old high school girls. So the movement spread into the high school, and I interviewed some of the Argentinian feminists, and it was very clear. They said that the feminist movement is our entry point into all other social movements, like the labor movement, like the, sort of anti-racist movement, migrant struggles, and so on. So this is because this strike movement is redefining politics in this deep solidaristic manner, which is redefining community action.
Well, one last thing I wanted to talk to you about, Tithi, is before we run out of time, is you've mentioned a couple times, and it's clear in the book that the goal is includes recognizing, and it's, by the way, is one of the premises I operate by, that we will not save the planet under the current system, that it is just inevitably leading us to tragic collapse beyond that which we've already, well beyond that which we've already created for ourselves. And I just wonder if you could say a bit about that before we part.
Oh, absolutely. First of all, the horizon of action is narrowing for us because of this climate crisis that we are facing. If our choices to get rid of the system are starker than ever before. How is, we can talk about the feminist aspect of this in this sense. The New York Times this morning reported that food shortage in this world is assuming alarming proportions because of the climate crisis. Now, women in all countries almost are primarily responsible for both food production. The vast majority of agricultural workers are women, but also for food preparation within the house. 70% of water collection and water management work globally is done by women. So this so the climate crisis affects all of humanity, but it affects poor and working women disproportionately. So women are at the um, um, up forefront of climate justice movements because this is their lives that we're talking about. So I think one of the things that we have to realize is capitalism has put profit before people to such a sort of disastrous and apocalyptic extent that now the very existence of life and the reproduction of life in this planet has become has reached a crisis point, right? So I think what we want to do is wrest our lives back and the recreation of lives back from the system back into the hands of humanity and collective decision making as to how our lives should be ordered. So this is where I think one of the frameworks that I operate with is I show that there are two things that go on under capitalism. One are processes of life making, which is not just biological reproduction, but life making in the sense of the various social practices that are necessary for a little infant to grow into a full-grown adult. So the food, the housing, the schooling, the education, the hospitals, the recreation that this individual gets creates the individual and affects her life chances or his life chances. And so those processes of life making, so the schools, hospitals, parks, water, air, clean air, healthy neighborhoods, public transport, as well as food and shelter, those processes of life making are vastly denigrated by capitalism. Capitalism only pays for those processes as much as it absolutely has to. But all its focus is on profit making. So life making is actually subordinated under profit making. And so, and obviously, women play a disproportionately large role in the life-making processes in our world. And this is why women in public services, such as nursing and teaching, are the greatest percentage in not just the United States, but globally. Now, what we are seeing around us in terms of the anti-austerity movement is people trying to take their lives back from the profit-making processes. We're seeing movements against water privatization, such as in Cochabamba, Bolivia, and Ireland. We are seeing movements for clean air and clean water, such as in Flint, Michigan, and Detroit. We are seeing movements in care work industries, such as teachers and nurses, and these are our resources of hope, because this is the global working class fighting back against austerity and trying to restore care back into our lives and into our livelihoods. A care not in the sort of, again, personal way, but in the political sense, where every human has the right to a rich development and a rich collective existence. So this is, I think, the challenge of the climate justice movement right now as to how it can link up with other anti-systemic movements, such which we can learn. So, for instance, from indigenous communities as to how actually fights against, sort of settler colonialism are also fights against capitalist sort of pipelines and so on, but is actually a fight to preserve the rights of the community and to restore a balance between humanity and nature and our natural world. So,
I'm sorry, but unfortunately, I think we're going to have to leave it there. I will
Absolutely.
give you 30 seconds if you like
No, it's okay. I'm done.
Okay, then I would conclude by saying that there is an intersectionality there, and it is in the end the struggle of life against death, isn't it? So we'll have to leave it there. I'm so sorry about that, but Professor Tithi Bhattacharya, thank you for co-writing this book, which I am once again holding in my hand, Feminism for the 99%, a manifesto available from Verso Books. And thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you, Richard. It was wonderful. Thank you very much for having me. Goodbye.